Today we will explore one of the most enigmatic and protected places on the planet, the vast complex of underground archives of the Vatican, where, in silence and shadow, rest the most precious and controversial documents of Western civilization, many of them dating back to the darkest times of the Middle Ages. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. In the heart of Rome, surrounded by walls that have stood for more than a millennium, stands a city that is not simply a city. The Vatican, the smallest sovereign state in the world, occupies less than half a square kilometre of Italian territory. But what it lacks in geographic extent, it more than makes up for in historical depth. Beneath its marble, its gardens, and its grand basilicas, there exists a world that most people will never see. A world of documents, parchments, letters, and records that have accumulated over centuries of spiritual and temporal power. And at the deepest center of that world, there is a vault that guards what was never meant for ordinary eyes. The story we are about to trace does not begin with a specific date, nor with an isolated event. It begins with an idea that shaped the West for more than 1,000 years. The idea that the Catholic Church was, at once, the guardian of souls and the arbiter of the destiny of nations. To carry out that role, it needed records, it needed memory. And memory in that world was made of parchment, ink, and wax seals. Medieval Europe was a continent in permanent tension. Kingdoms rose and vanished, empires fragmented. But the Church endured. And while it endured, it documented. Every letter sent by a pope to a king or emperor was carefully copied before being sealed and dispatched. Every decree, every excommunication, every alliance, every peace treaty mediated by papal power was recorded somewhere in the immense archives that grew, generation after generation, in the corridors and secret chambers of the Holy See. The Middle Ages, a period that historians conventionally place between the 5th and 15th centuries, was the stage for some of the most profound transformations in human history. In those 10 centuries, Europe witnessed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the rise of the barbarian kingdoms, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Black Death, the East-West Schism, and the slow awakening of what would become the modern world. And at each of these crucial moments, the Catholic Church was present, participating, influencing, sometimes dominating, which means that its archives are, in many ways, the secret diary of Western civilization. But why secret? Why did so many of these documents remain guarded for so long, inaccessible to scholars, historians, and the general public? The answer to that question reveals much about the nature of power and about the weight carried by those who wield it. To understand the Vatican's secret archives, as it is officially called, one must first understand what the word secret means in this context. In medieval Latin, secretum did not necessarily mean something hidden or forbidden. It meant, above all, something private, something that belongs to the Lord, something that is under the custody of its owner. The archive was secret in the sense that it belonged to the Pope. It was the personal property of the pontiff, not a public repository. This distinction is important, but it does not erase the fact that many of its contents were, over the centuries, kept away from outside eyes for reasons that went far beyond mere bureaucratic protocol. The formal founding of the archive is generally associated with the papacy of Pope Paul V, who between the years 1605 and 1621 centralized in a single place the documents scattered across various Vatican offices. But the history of the Vatican archives is far older. The popes had kept records since the first centuries of Christianity. What Paul V did was to organize what already existed, to give it a structure, a proper location, and an official guard. Beneath the marble and frescoed halls the world knows, beneath the papal apartments and the art galleries, there exists a structure that descends into the earth. The repositories, corridors, and underground chambers that make up the heart of the archive are, for most people, completely invisible. It is there that the most fragile documents live, the oldest, the most sensitive. The controlled environment, the stable temperature, the calculated humidity. Everything was planned to preserve what time and neglect would destroy anywhere else. The underground corridors stretch for dozens of kilometers in linear shelving. It is estimated that if all the documents were arranged in a straight line, the total length would exceed 85 kilometers of records. 85 kilometers of parchments, papers, bindings, and boxes, containing within them letters from kings and emperors, acts of councils, trial records, confessions, declarations of war, peace treaties, and documents whose content has not yet been fully understood by modern scholars. It is difficult to imagine this in concrete terms. Think of a library that began growing more than a millennium ago and never stopped. Think of the popes who succeeded one another, generation after generation, each adding his own correspondence, his own records, his own confidential documents. Think of the medieval scribes who spent their lives copying texts by candlelight, preserving for posterity words that the powerful deemed too important to be entrusted to human memory alone, and then begin to imagine what might be kept within. The Middle Ages was an era of intense faith and equally intense power. The Church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was a state within states, with its own laws, its own courts, its own diplomatic corps, and at times, its own military army. The medieval popes corresponded with Muslim sultans and with Byzantine emperors. They negotiated with Mongol khans. They sent legates to kingdoms that most Europeans would never see. And all of that correspondence, or at least part of it, was preserved. Among the documents identified in the Vatican archives, some stand out for their historical weight and for the light they cast upon crucial moments of medieval history. To understand their significance, one must travel the path that led to their creation, to their storage, and eventually to their partial revelation to the outside world. Let us return then to the 13th century. Europe is in full ferment. The feudal system is transforming, cities are growing, commerce is expanding, and the Church faces one of its greatest internal challenges, the movements deemed heretical that arise in various regions of Europe and question in varied ways the authority and doctrine of the Church of Rome. It is in this context that the Inquisition emerges, not as an isolated event, but as an institutional process, slow and complex, that developed over decades. The medieval Inquisition, unlike the later versions that would come to arise in Portugal and Spain, was established by Pope Gregory V in 1231, with the declared aim of investigating and combating heresy. The inquisitors were, for the most part, Dominican or Franciscan friars, trained in theology and in interrogation techniques. What the Vatican archives hold on the medieval Inquisition is of an impressive scope. Records of interrogations, lists of the accused, sentences handed down, appeals sent to the Pope, reports from local inquisitors. These documents, many of them still not fully studied, offer a unique window into the inner workings of an institution that profoundly shaped the culture, religion, and psychology of medieval Europe. The interrogation records are especially revealing. In them, trained scribes noted with meticulous detail the questions asked and the answers given by the accused. These documents allow modern historians to reconstruct, with a richness of detail impossible in other sources, what ordinary people of the Middle Ages thought about God, about death, about life after death. They are, in a certain sense, portraits of the medieval mentality far more vivid and personal than any theological treatise written by a scholar of the time. Each line of these records is a window into a medieval mind, into its fears, its beliefs, its hopes, and its contradictions. But the archives hold far more than Inquisition records. They also hold the documents related to one of the most dramatic episodes of medieval history, the trial against the Order of the Knights Templar. The Order of the Templars was founded around 1119 during the Crusades, with the aim of protecting the Christian pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, the order grew in power and wealth in an extraordinary way. The Templars became bankers to kings, owners of vast expanses of land throughout Europe, and a military force of the First Order. They operated one of the first banking networks of the Western world, allowing pilgrims to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in distant lands, demonstrating sophistication far beyond what one usually imagines for that period. And it was precisely this wealth and this power that would ultimately determine their fate. At the beginning of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, found himself in serious financial difficulties, in debt to the Templars and facing an unprecedented fiscal crisis. The king made a decision that would change the history of Europe. In October 1307, He ordered the simultaneous arrest of hundreds of members of the order throughout France. The accusations Philip brought against the Templars were serious and varied. Blasphemy, idolatry, ritualistic practices deemed heretical, denial of Christ. The list was extensive and, for many modern historians, clearly motivated by political and financial reasons more than by genuine religious concerns. But in a world where heresy was the gravest crime a Christian could commit, the accusations carried enough weight to justify drastic action. What makes this episode especially relevant to our story is the fact that the Vatican archives hold the complete records of the apostolic trial conducted by Pope Clement V against the order, and among these records there is a document that, for centuries, remained practically inaccessible to the outside world, the Chinon Parchment. The Chinon Parchment is a long and detailed document recording the private absolution proceedings that Pope Clement V conducted in secret against the leaders of the order, including its Grand Master Jacques de Molay. The document reveals that the Pope, in his private judgment, absolved the Templars of the charges of heresy, acknowledging that many of the confessions had been obtained under pressure. But the parchment remained buried in the archives, and the order was dissolved all the same in 1312 at the Council of Vienne, yielding to the political pressures of the French king. Jacques de Molay, the order's last Grand Master, did not survive the consequences of the proceedings and lost his life in 1314, taking with him the secrets of an institution that had lasted nearly 2 centuries. The Chinon Parchment only came to light in 2001, when the Italian scholar Barbara Frail, working in the archive, identified it among documents that had been incorrectly catalogued. In 2007, the Vatican published a facsimile edition of the document, allowing the world to see for the first time what had been hidden for 7 centuries. The story of the Templars, told in so many different ways over the centuries, gained a new chapter, and the Vatican archives revealed once again their character as keepers of truths long buried. But the Templar trial is not the only story of power and tragedy that the archives hold. There are others equally complex and equally revealing of the nature of the relations between spiritual power and temporal power in the Middle Ages and in the centuries that followed. Let us return, then, to the great disputes that shook the medieval world. One of the most impressive series in the Vatican records is the correspondence between the popes and the European monarchs during the period of the Crusades. The Crusades, those military expeditions that the Church organized to conquer and defend the Holy Land between the 11th and 13th centuries, were undertakings of extraordinary logistical and political complexity. And the Vatican archives hold the correspondence that sustained this undertaking. The letters of summons sent by the popes to the kings, the negotiations over the financing of the campaigns, the reports sent by military leaders to the Pope, the debates over strategy and over the treatment of conquered peoples. These documents reveal the Crusades in a manner very different from what popular tradition tends to imagine. They reveal not only the religious motivations that the popes publicly proclaimed, but also the complex political, economic, and strategic considerations that shaped real decisions. They reveal the conflicts among the different Crusader leaders, the misunderstandings between the European powers and the papacy, and the attempts, not always successful, to coordinate an enterprise that involved armies from different kingdoms with frequently conflicting interests. There are documents showing that, behind the rhetoric of holy war, there was also room for diplomacy, for negotiation, for the pragmatic recognition that eternal conflict served the interests of no party. The archives preserve records of communications with leaders of the Middle East, evidence of a dialogue between civilizations that the popular narrative of the Crusades tends to obscure. It is precisely this complexity that makes the Vatican archives so valuable to historians. They show the medieval world not as an age of absolute certainties, but as a period of conflicts, doubts, and negotiations. They show a church that proclaimed eternal truths while negotiating, day by day, with the contingencies of a world in permanent transformation. The medieval papacy was an extraordinarily sophisticated administrative machine for its time. The popes had at their disposal a chancery, a kind of executive department, which processed an enormous volume of correspondence with all of Christendom. Every letter received was registered. Every letter sent was copied. The papal registers, which historians call the registers of bulls, constitute one of the most important documentary series in the Vatican archives and date back to the 9th century. These registers are in essence the account books of medieval power. In them are recorded the land grants made by the Church, the appointments of bishops and abbots, the excommunications pronounced against recalcitrant kings, the marriage dispensations granted to powerful nobles. They are administrative documents, but each one tells a story. Each land grant reveals a political alliance. Each excommunication records a conflict between spiritual and secular power. Each marriage dispensation is a window into the dynastic negotiations that determine the fate of entire nations. And then there are the documents of the Apostolic Penitentiary, perhaps the most secret of the secret archives. The Apostolic Penitentiary is an ecclesiastical tribunal that has existed since the 12th century and deals with the most intimate and private matters of the Catholic conscience, the sins that only the Pope has the authority to absolve, the special dispensations, the situations that the general rules cannot accommodate. The archives of the penitentiary are, by their very nature, the most rigorously protected in all of the Holy See. For centuries, they were completely inaccessible to any external researcher. Only in 2009, under Benedict XVI, were these archives partially opened to scholars, revealing a completely unknown dimension of medieval religious life. What scholars found in these archives was surprising. They found requests for absolution, sent from every corner of Christendom to Rome, confessions of clerics who had violated their vows, of nobles who carried situations that parish rules could not resolve. They found marriage dispensations that reveal the complex kinship networks of medieval aristocratic families. They found cases that shed light on the daily life, the fears, and the hopes of people who lived centuries ago and whose voices would otherwise never have reached us. The archives of the penitentiary offer something extraordinarily rare, a window into the inner experience of ordinary people of the Middle Ages, their anxieties, and their moral dilemmas. But who throughout all these centuries had access to this documentary treasure? And who was responsible for preserving it? For most of the history of the Vatican archives, access was restricted to an extremely small circle of ecclesiastical officials. The archivists, called custodes or guardians, were figures of great importance within the Vatican hierarchy. Their task was to catalogue the documents received, retrieve the documents requested by the Pope, and ensure that the archive remained organized and accessible for the administrative purposes for which it had been created. But being accessible to the Vatican administration did not mean being accessible to the outside world. For centuries, the archive remained closed to external researchers and historians. Many of the documents kept in the archives had political implications that were still alive, revealing commitments and agreements that could embarrass influential noble families, sovereign states, and the Church itself in its relations with the contemporary world. There was also a more fundamental reason: the medieval and pre-modern conception of the archive as the private property of power. The documents kept by the popes were, in the mindset of the time, the property of the popes, not the heritage of humanity. The idea that historical documents should be accessible to the general public is a modern idea, a product of the Enlightenment and the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was precisely this modern spirit that finally led to the partial opening of the Vatican archives. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII made a historic decision. He opened the Vatican archives to outside researchers for the first time in centuries. The decision was controversial within the Roman Curia, where many feared the revelations that historians might make once granted access to the medieval and modern documents of the Holy See. But Leo XIII was a man of intellectual temperament and strategic vision. He understood that the isolation of the archives was fueling speculation more harmful to the Church than any historical revelation. He understood that an institution that refused to open its sources to academic inquiry placed itself in the eyes of the modern world in the position of one who fears the truth. And so, with a decision of profound implications, the Pope ordered that the doors of the archives be opened. The opening of the archives in 1881 was a silent revolution in the academic world. Historians from all over Europe converged on Rome, eager to delve into documents that had never been studied by outside eyes. What they found was, in many cases, exactly what they expected: Evidence of the enormous political influence of the medieval church, records of its interventions in every aspect of European public life, documentation of its wealth and its power. But they also found something many did not expect, evidence of the Church's humanity, of its uncertainties, its internal conflicts, its attempts, not always successful, to reconcile its ideals with the realities of power. They found popes who doubted, cardinals who disagreed, bishops who negotiated. They found an institution that was at once extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily human. One of the first great scholars to work in the archives after the opening was the German historian Ludwig von Pastor, who spent decades immersed in the Vatican documents to produce his monumental History of the Popes, a work that to this day remains a fundamental reference for the study of the medieval and modern papacy. Pastor's work revealed a picture of the papacy far more complex and nuanced than any previous history had managed to trace. It was proof that opening the archives was, after all, an act of confidence in the capacity of historical truth to withstand academic scrutiny. But even with the opening of 1881, many documents remained inaccessible. Access was limited to researchers with specific credentials, and even for those researchers, there were restrictions on which documents could be consulted. The opening process was gradual, advancing decade after decade, with each pontificate revealing new sets of documents and maintaining restrictions on others. Under the pontificate of John Paul II, the archives relating to the Second World War period were partially opened. Under Benedict XVI, the archives of the Apostolic Penitentiary became accessible for the first time. And in 2020, under the pontificate of Francis, the archives relating to the papacy of Pius X were finally opened to researchers. Each opening revealed new layers of a history that seemed inexhaustible. There is inevitably the question that hangs over any discussion of the Vatican archives. What else is kept inside? What has not yet been revealed? Which documents remain in the underground vaults, waiting for the moment when someone rediscovers them, or when the decision to open them finally arrives? There is no definitive answer to these questions. What exists are hints, clues that the Vatican archivists themselves and the scholars who work in the archive occasionally let slip. It is known that documents exist relating to matters still considered sensitive. It is known that some documentary collections have been only superficially catalogued and that their precise contents are unknown, even to the archivists who work in the underground corridors. It is known that the process of gradual opening that has characterized the last centuries has not yet reached its final point. And it is precisely this incomplete opening that fuels the public's fascination with the Vatican archives. Because history, when not fully told, invites curiosity. When a door is partially open, what lies beyond it always seems more significant than when it is fully in view. The Vatican archives are, in this sense, a perfect metaphor for history itself, always partially revealed, always keeping something that the moment has not yet come to show. The documents that lie in the underground vaults of the Vatican are the silent testimony of centuries of civilization. Parchments that survived wars, fires, sackings, forced transfers between European capitals. During the Napoleonic period, between 1810 and 1817, the archives were transferred to Paris by order of Napoleon Bonaparte himself, who wanted personal access to the documents of papal power. More than 300 carts carried boxes and bundles of documents along the roads of Europe. When, after Napoleon's defeat, the Pope secured the return of the archive, not all the documents came back. Some were lost in transport. Others were sold, dispersed, destroyed. One of the greatest documentary collections in human history suffered in those 7 years, losses that can never be fully assessed. But what remains is still immensely rich, and the work of scholars who, generation after generation, dedicate themselves to exploring that vast documentary territory continues to reveal, slowly, the contours of a past that would otherwise be inaccessible. Today, the Vatican Apostolic Archives, as they were officially renamed in 2019, employ a team of specialized archivists and restorers who work with state-of-the-art techniques to preserve documents that are sometimes more than 1,000 years old. High-resolution photography equipment, full-spectrum scanners, sophisticated environmental control systems. All the tools of modern technology are being employed to ensure that what has survived for millennia can continue to exist for further millennia. The digitization process begun in recent decades is gradually making accessible to the general public documents that previously only a handful of accredited scholars could consult. High-resolution images of rare medieval documents are being made available online, allowing anyone with an internet connection to see for the first time what the popes wrote and received centuries ago. It is a democratization of access to the past that the medieval popes themselves could never have imagined. It is this proximity between past and present, this sense that the dead still have things to tell us, that makes the story of the Vatican archives so powerful and so permanently fascinating. It is not merely curiosity about hidden secrets, though that curiosity is entirely understandable. It is something deeper. It is the perception that our own identity, as a civilization, as a culture, as a species defined by its capacity to preserve and transmit memory, is partly kept in those underground vaults. The Vatican archives are, in the end, a mirror. An imperfect mirror, fragmented, partial, as every historical mirror inevitably is. But a mirror that, when gazed upon with sufficient attention, reveals something of ourselves, something about the nature of power, about the mechanisms of faith, about the persistence of human hope in the face of the finitude of individual life. Every pope who governed the Church for centuries left behind in the archives, even unwittingly, the faithful portrait of his era, of his priorities, of his fears and his ambitions. The medieval monks who copied texts by candlelight did not know they were creating something that would endure for millennia. They did so for reasons that made sense within their own context. Preserving the sacred word, keeping the Church's administrative records, maintaining the decisions of councils alive. But the result of their labor far transcended their original intentions. They created a memory that all of humanity inherited. And while the Vatican archivists continue their silent work in the underground corridors, while researchers continue deciphering medieval texts under the cold light of the reading rooms, the conversation between past and present continues. A conversation that began over 1,000 years ago, and that, as long as there are human beings curious enough to ask questions, will never end. The documents resting there are in no hurry. They have already waited centuries. They can wait longer. And when they finally reach the outside world, under the gaze of an attentive researcher, they will carry with them not only information about the past, but something even more precious, proof that the past is never truly dead, that it remains alive, carefully kept, waiting for the moment when someone will bring it back to the surface. The underground vaults of the Vatican remain, silent and patient, guarding what has not yet been revealed, guarding the secrets of a world that existed long ago, but whose echoes still resound in the world we live in today. Each parchment kept, there is a thread connecting the present to the past, a reminder that we are all heirs to decisions made by people we never knew, in times we never lived. If this journey through the corridors of time and through the medieval mysteries of the Vatican has awakened in you the same curiosity that moves the researchers who spend their lives among these documents, then you already understand why stories like this need to be told and retold. The Vatican archives teach us that true knowledge demands patience, that the greatest secrets of history are revealed not all at once, but gradually, layer by layer, document by document. Just as the researchers who return year after year to those underground corridors, because they know there is always more to discover, we invite you to return to this channel where new stories await you. Subscribe so you don't miss any of them, like this video so more people can find these fascinating accounts, and leave in the comments your reflection. Which secret of the Vatican archives would you most like to see revealed? Your curiosity is, after all, what keeps the flame of this investigation alive.